My favorite motifs is the triple goddess, which is the idea of the mother, the maiden, and the crone, which I definitely work into the story with Demeter and with Hecate, to kind of just argue that one of patriarchy's biggest cracks is the idea of women coming together, and women coming together through generations, and tying that up with generational trauma and the sort of idea of that energy carrying onwards from mother to daughter, and how that can in turn be powerful, but it can also be what hurts us.
Here with Bea Fitzgerald, the author of Girl Goddess Queen, that I have here, and it's so stunning. And we're gonna talk about the book. So I wanted you to start introducing it a little bit, because I know it's gonna come out in Italy very soon, but I know probably a lot of my followers haven't read it yet. So if you could just give us an intro about it.
I'm very excited for it to come out in Italy, because I was in Italy last year and I saw Greek mythology retellings everywhere, and I'm so excited for my book to be on one of those tables. So Girl Goddess Queen is a fantasy rom-com reimagining of the myth of Hades and Persephone. It is YA, and it opens with Persephone on this island that she's been kept on her entire life, to keep her safe from the Olympian gods. But then one day it's decided that she's going to have to marry one of those gods, and she realizes that with her father as king of the skies and her mother with overview of the lands, the only place she can run is the underworld. Unfortunately, the very hot king of the underworld, Hades, wants absolutely nothing to do with her, does not want her there, does not want to anger the Olympian gods and have them retaliate. He just wants nothing to do with that world. So Persephone blackmails him into giving her hospitality. She binds him with an ancient rule of hospitality. But when it becomes clear that she's working on a way to take down the Olympian gods, Hades wants in and the two pair up. But when Persephone's parents find out where she is, they realize the only way she can stay long enough to enact that plan is if they enter a fake marriage and convince the world that they're in love.
Never read anything about Hades and Persephone, specifically them. Of course I knew the story behind it, as we've been told the story, but to read this in this way was completely new, and I loved it so much. So that's why I wanted to ask you, how and why did you choose exactly Persephone and Hades? Because there are a lot of mythological figures, gods, and so on. So how did you come up with the idea of writing about specifically them?
They were always my favorite growing up. I was obsessed with Greek mythology growing up. And there was this version that I think a lot of us in the UK certainly were told, in the sort of way that we sanitize those stories for children, that basically went along the lines of Persephone was kidnapped, but it's okay, she wanted it because her mum was really overbearing, and Hades loves her so much, and through that situation she ends up getting all this power and she really comes into her own, all of this. And I really liked that version of that story for sort of the idea of finding power through love, the idea of freedom. I think it's one of those first stories we encounter that tells us, it's okay to have a complicated relationship with your family. But then growing up and getting a more academic leaning towards mythology and ancient history, you kind of realize that's not the full story. But specifically, I have such a fascination with the way that stories endure. I love the idea that people have always been people, and the fact that these stories have connected with us for thousands of years. So I think that then just made me love that story even more, because I found it really fascinating the way that there was this ancient version that really resonated with the ancient people, and there was this version in the modern cultural zeitgeist that's huge. There are so many retellings in that vein, and the way that people connect to that story for a different reason. So I kind of wanted to play around with it and write a version that very much lent into that more modern zeitgeisty idea of it, but still drew from the ancient and was still addressing themes that the ancient story toyed with and engaged with. And also just my nerdy obsession with Persephone. Like, she's such a fascinating character in mythology. She goes from Kore to Persephone. There's a bit of Despoina in there as well. And I think that's kind of the one of the original coming of age stories, Persephone going from little girl to chaos bringer or death bringer, whatever you want to interpret Persephone as. So I just thought it would be a great story to write in a YA space and to kind of engage with as I say, I wanted to make a version that was as relevant for modern teenagers as the original was for ancients. So engaging with teenage pressures and slut shaming and purity culture, all these things that like teenagers are dealing with, but with my love of ancient mythology at its heart.
Yeah, that was like really interesting, because I found a lot of themes that are so modern and we can see nowadays like every day in our lives. So we're gonna dive in a little bit about that too later on. And so since you just mentioned it, I wanted to talk a little bit about exactly the way Persephone goes from Kore to Persephone. And I think that's not something everyone knows. I mean, I've studied a little bit of mythology when I was in high school, but like no one ever told me about this. So I was super like interested when I was reading it. So can you tell us a little bit more about this transition?
Yeah, so in terms of like the actual ancient history of it, Persephone's like kind of first seen in stories as Despoina, and she's seen in relation to the underworld with her mother and Poseidon as like gods of the underworld. So that also inspired part of the story with the idea that like Persephone already had this connection to the underworld before Hades brought her down there, because that's a version of the story that we have. And in terms of those ancient texts, normally when she's being written about on that island with her mother, she's written about as Kore, and then when she's written in the context of the underworld, she's Persephone. The first time we ever see her in any written text, it's Homer, it's the Iliad, the Odyssey, where she's the Dread Queen, and Odysseus is terrified she's going to send a Medusa head after him, and there's really very little about Hades in that situation. The first time we ever encounter her in story is as this terrifying figure that might punish the hero. So that transition from Kore to Persephone kind of just happens situationally, but in the story, it's very much part of that coming of age narrative and very much part of that sort of idea of the pressures that have been placed on her. She's been told, you are a good and pure maiden. Your only option, if you want to stay safe, is to marry, and if you want to be happy, we want to get you a good marriage, which means we need as many options as possible, which means you need to be the most perfect person to ever exist, so that every man is going to want to be with you and we can choose the safest, kindest one. So that Kore name in the book is really wrapped up in all these sort of like expectations, but also specifically in the opening scene, she gets given that name by her father because she asks for too much, because she's too ambitious, and it's very much a name that's designed to keep her in her place, to never stop reminding her of who she is and what she is in this world. And then Persephone is a name that she kind of gives herself. Well, Hades suggests it after she indicates it would be something she likes. And it's very much emblematic of her taking control of that narrative, that sort of idea that she's been put into this box and told this is what you are, and it's her saying, no, this is what I am. And also kind of spitefully against her father, which I enjoy. And it's, a large, I think it's a large part of her arc, that actual naming process, but it's also symbolic of the wider arc she goes through. So it's a nice transition.
Yeah, I love that. And so like a big part of Persephone's life, it's like literally her relationship with her mother, Demeter. And so I think like it's a super complicated relationship, but so we have like two sides of it, because we have the mother that wants to protect her. She wants to she literally basically locks her on an island, just like protect her from other gods and so on. But on the other side, she's a little bit like controlling. So I wanted to dive in a little bit about this, because a relationship with her mother is the one that actually shapes her life after that. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so that ancient story, the one that we have in the Homeric hymn, is almost more about Demeter than it is Persephone. It's about a mother's loss, and it's also a sort of ambitious story for the women of ancient Greece whose daughters would be married off, of like, imagine if you had the power to kind of have more control in this narrative. And then that modern version that I think I grew up with, a lot of people grew up with, it's very much like Demeter's an overbearing mother, and I think that stems from the fact that she kept her on an island. And I kind of went into it going, well, wouldn't you keep your daughter on an island if like the gods were doing all the things that they were doing? So I kind of just wanted to lean into like, I had this big question as I was writing it, which was basically, is it even possible to be a good mother in this world? And what does good motherhood look like? Because every decision Demeter makes in the book is to keep Persephone safe. And as I say, it comes back to that idea of like the only way she's going to be safe is if she's in a marriage. The best marriage means she needs to be the best possible person. Demeter tries to love her into being that with like constant praise. But on the other side of that, that feels like Persephone is only loved by her mother if she's being good. It means that she is kind of being conditioned to be this sort of way. And I just wanted to write a story where, and bear in mind, you're seeing it from Persephone's perspective, so it's a little bit biased. But as the writer, I was very much like, I want you to 100% know why Demeter has made every single decision she has and still appreciate the fact that someone can have good intentions and still mess a kid up. And I just really wanted to lean into that messiness, that sort of idea that like no one has to be at fault for there to be hurt feelings, because I think that's something Persephone goes through, where she's like, I feel really horrible about this, but I don't blame her. And it kind of invalidates her own feelings when she's like, but if I'm not blaming her, then I have no reason to be upset. So why am I upset? Like, I really wanted to lean into those sort of nuances of like really messy relationships where two things, even in contradiction, can be true at once. And your feelings are valid just because you feel them. That's what feelings are. And kind of just not try and intellectualize that as Persephone does most of the book. Yeah.
And also, like, this relationship with her mother is also the reason why she has been taught for most of her life to be like this perfect kid. She has to like impress everyone, and that's how she grows up to be. But at some point, she kind of snaps, and I think that's really interesting because she basically decides to be chaos bringer, which is like defines herself like that. And I feel like it's really important to underline how our relationship with our mothers can also define the person that we come to be at some point and how we feel about it. Because I mean, we're perceived as women that okay, we are in a different era, like I get it, things have been very different since probably the gods' time, but I feel like these themes are really like modern and important to talk about.
Yeah, I wanted to draw threads from like this world is literally patriarchy. Like Persephone's father is the king, and we're not living in this world. I mean, most of us are not living in this world where we're being married off. But I wanted to draw those connecting threads from like that version of patriarchy through to its modern version, which is things that are in the book, things like, you know, telling girls to smile, to be pleasant, to, you know, keep an eye on like their appearance, like all those things that we end up like blaming them for, and just see how that kind of forms a through narrative from that very ancient version of patriarchy through to the modern day. And in terms of her relationship with her mother as well, one of my favorite, I'm a literature girly at heart. My love of the ancient in an academic sense comes from studying the plays. And, you know, I did English lit at uni. And one of my favorite motifs is the triple goddess, which is the idea of the mother, the maiden, and the crone, which I definitely work into the story with Demeter and with Hecate, to kind of just argue that one of patriarchy's biggest cracks is the idea of women coming together, and women coming together through generations, and tying that up with generational trauma and the sort of idea of that energy carrying onwards from mother to daughter, and how that can in turn be powerful, but it can also be what hurts us.
Yeah. And like since we're talking about this, there's like another theme that it's related to patriarchy as well. So like how also men are perceived and how are they supposed to be perceived. So let's talk about Hades. So there's this quote in your book that I underlined that I'm gonna read now so we can talk about it, because I feel like it's super interesting and defines like some of the choices that this god has made. So I'm just gonna read it. It's something that Hades says, talking to Persephone. So he says, "My reputation is a tricky thing. It's not my ego that protects it. As far as that's concerned, people can say what they want," he says. "But I have this crown because Zeus believed Kronos chose the most powerful beings when he snatched Poseidon and me, the man who might grow to be a threat. Zeus thought that if he gave us some modicum of power, we'd never rise against him. But if Zeus found out I did all this, that I'm not the shining example of masculine power he believes me to be, not a threat in the way only a man could be, he'd take the crown back. And being a king is the only thing that gives me the security to do all this in peace. Even the other gods of the underworld don't know about this. That's why it's hidden." And then basically Persephone goes on this reflection about what actually Hades makes, what he crafts, and she says that Hades' metal shop is full of delicate, stunning sculptures and jewels, nothing built for use but for aesthetic, art for art's sake. So I think this is really interesting because Hades has to behave in a certain way, to look in a certain way to the eyes of the other gods, and to actually portray this masculine power that he's supposed to have. Mm-hmm. That's exactly like what we are taught. Like, we see a man in a certain way, and that's like, we are so shocked when we see like a man cry, for example, but that's completely normal, and we should appreciate it more. And that's why I want to talk about Hades, because that's also why she was like, Persephone thought she was gonna like encounter this god, this evil bad man, and then she found out it's not like that at all. So what do you say about it?
Yeah, I think part of what I really enjoy with their pairing is, obviously, as I say, Persephone's been taught her entire life, like, be this way. She's kind of got this complex that like she will only be loved if she acts this way. So she's someone that has learned to kind of weaponize facade and pretense, and to create this version of herself that's different from who she is inside. And her arc is kind of letting that internal person come to the outside. So in writing a rom-com, I wanted, like, you know, the reflection of that, which is in turn, Hades has also weaponized his facade and his reputation. He's created this sort of illusion of very expected masculinity that he can then step behind and be himself. And masculinity is a really like complicated thing in the book, where there's this sort of very toxic version of it, and then there's sort of the reality of it. And I think you see that with the other gods as well. When we first encounter them, they're very lewd, they're very like, you know, Hermes is like, oh, like, how was the unwrapping? Like, but then actually when we get to know Hermes, he's one of the gods that respects Persephone more than anyone else. So you kind of get these hints that maybe everyone is pretending to act a certain way because this world is so binary in its expectations of how men and women will behave. And it's also the idea that that binary is something Zeus uses to control people and to keep his power. It's that sort of gendered expectation as a literal method of control. In terms of, so Hades has that aspect of like projecting, which I think pairs well with Persephone. But in terms of like who he is, that kind of came about through research. I drew a lot on like the ancient world. With Persephone, I can go on and on, but with Hades, there's not as much. And that aspect of him was drawn from, as I say, I was always curious about what made this myth so popular. And I think what I came down to often was that Persephone gets a crown and a throne through her marriage to Hades. And I kind of asked, well, what does Hades get from his marriage to Persephone? And one of the things he gets is he gets this symbol of a cornucopia, and he gets these associations with fertility and new life. And I really liked that he was able to lean into a softer side of himself through his relationship to Persephone. And that's something I drew on in the book. He's not a farmer in mind, but he has this really like creative side. And unlike creative gods like Apollo, where it's all about like being the best and being the best being a form of masculinity, Hades is just like, I like to paint, dude, like, so I'm gonna paint. And it's really sweet and wholesome. And I think I've just read a lot of feminist stories. I've read a lot of incredible ones, but I've also read a lot that are just very like girl boss and all men suck. And I just kind of wanted to address like how patriarchy is damaging for men in the book, you know. This idea that like they can't actually feel anything, that sexual relationships should just be about, you know, bragging rights. It just, the way they suppress their feelings, the way they then feel guilty for their feelings. And we're also dealing with a world of gods that have for a very long time been at war with the Titans, and a lot of them are kind of somewhat traumatized from that. You know, there's definitely a lot of generational trauma from Demeter that's passed on to Persephone. Hades is definitely one of those gods, and unlike them, he has found these healthy coping mechanisms. So it also ties into like wider conversations in the book about like mental health. You know, Persephone definitely has some anxiety, Hades has PTSD, and the way that like the expectation for men to be tough stops that kind of connection to their mental health. So that's also explored for Hades.
Yeah, that was interesting. Also, like how like it finds, as you said, like a healthy coping mechanism. he has to hide. Like that's crazy. I mean, we're used to think that we are in a healthy like society right now because we've improved so much, but actually we haven't fully. So there's like a lot to do still, and that's so interesting to like think about the gods and how different the world was, but still not so different, kind of. And that's really interesting for me. I wanted to like talk a little bit about your process of writing this book. So, I mean, we're talking about mythology, so I think like a lot of research has been put into this. So I wanted to ask you, like, how did you approach it, like your writing process and stuff?
Well, I'm a nerd, so I've kind of just been reading books about ancient history since I could read. And so when I kind of sat down with this project, I kind of already had a lot of the knowledge internally, but also wanted to crack the books out to make sure there wasn't anything seeping in from like Percy Jackson or something. So I got out a lot of my old university textbooks, and then I read pretty much every text I could find on Hades and Persephone and their story. And I charted basically the main plot beats of the myths. So things like the pomegranate, the famine, stuff like that. And that kind of formed the framework of this story. And I knew going in that I didn't want to write a retelling as was like on the market. I kind of saw it when I first started writing it as the sort of gap in between Percy Jackson and Circe. Like, that's for kids, this can be for teenagers, and then that's for adults. Obviously everyone should read Circe, it's amazing. But I knew going in that I didn't want to write just like a classic retelling where I just retold this story, mostly because I really love the ancient sources. So I was a bit like, if you want that, go read those, because they're great and they're lyrical and they're amazing. I knew I wanted to write a fantasy world. I knew I wanted to write a story that was for and about modern teenagers, and using that sort of framework, that connection to the teenagers that have come before us as a sort of way of talking about these big topics that I think are important in the current day. So what I did with that sort of basic plot outline was that I knew that every single beat in that story, every single aspect that I was drawing from the original stories, was either going to be subverted or lead into character development in some way. I think it's a very character driven story. As I say, I had that sort of coming of age idea, that idea of Kore and Persephone, and also wanting to write a fun and chaotic little rom-com, because that's the kind of thing that I gravitate towards, and just trying to line up the sort of romantic beats with the mythological beats, and then just doing a lot of reading of the ancient world generally, so that I could have these like fun little details. Like, I really wanted it to be a fantasy world that was drawing from the ancient world in every possible way. There are fun little Easter eggs in there. There are, aspects of the world that are created based on that, and also just having fun with the ancient world. Like, there's a part where they're like developing the afterlife for the humans, and they're doing all this research because they don't really understand what humans are like and what humans' paradise would be like. And they're like, I keep seeing all these ships everywhere. Like, do they like these? Do they want to build them or see them or like sail them? And just sort of have that sort of like, if an alien landed in ancient Greece, what would they think? Kind of drew a lot from that idea. So it was a lot of research, but it was also a lot of like throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what fit. And then this is what I came up with.
I mean, I think that like the world building also in the underworld was so clever. I liked it very much. So yeah, you did a really good. I honestly can't wait for people like to read it, like people I can talk to about it, because I mean, I have talked about it with people that have read it, but like not Italian people. So for me to talk to about like with my friends even, it's gonna be like super interesting. So this is like a question that I love asking authors, because I find it really like fun. So are you satisfied with like the response you've had for the book? And like, I mean, I'm sure you have received some really good in like reviews and stuff, but I wanted to ask like if you have received like something like reaction wise, something maybe particular that surprised you, or something you want to talk about.
Yeah, I don't know. I think my favorite thing is just that people seem to have been having a lot more fun with it than I thought they would. I think the phrase giggling and kicking my little feet has come up a lot, which has been delightful because I wrote it before the pandemic, but I was editing it during the pandemic, and I really just had this thought of like, I just want to make people happy. And I think people have found it funnier than I thought, because I don't know, once you've read the jokes 20 billion times, they stop being quite as funny. But I'm so glad that like people are having a fun time with it. I also like, again, as I say, like my love of the ancient stems from, in academic sense, the plays, and the plays were divided into two categories, either tragedy or comedy, and I feel like tragedy is very well served on the market, so I'm really glad I got to bring something comedic to this space as well. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the negative, like I get tagged in like a few things, and I think the one that always gets me is like some people are like, oh, Persephone is quite immature, and I'm like, yeah, like you are correct, she is a teenager. It's one of those comments where I'm like, yeah, I can absolutely see how that would like annoy you. And also with the romance where it's like, I just wanted to shake them because they were so obviously in love, and I'm like, that's why I wrote sticks, so that there's a character in there to shake them and be like, look, you're in love. So
oh my god, I loved it so much. Okay, I have to stop like being so obsessed with it. But yeah, also and I have a second book coming out. So I wanted to like, if you can tell us something about it, because I know it's still like something new, you just announced it, and yeah.
I have Girl Goddess Queen sold in the same week that my adult fiction sold, so I went from zero, and Girl Goddess Queen was on submission for like a year and a half. It was really like you wait a year and a half for a book deal and then two come along at once. So I have a second Greek myth YA coming out next year. It's sapphic and it's rivals to lovers, and more details will be announced at some point, I hope. And then I just announced Then Things Went Dark, which is my adult thriller. It's about 6 of the most pretentious people you will ever meet on a reality show on a desert island, and then one of them dies live on camera, and it's like, did 12 million people just watch a murder live on TV? And it's really, really dramatic. I mean, it's a murder on a reality TV show, but I think this is one of those ones where it's clear that I watch a lot of reality TV, and it's clear that I'm here for the drama just as much as I'm here for the murder. It's campy, it's queer, it is so many twists and turns, so much drama, and I'm really excited because I had a lot of fun writing it. I think part of my love of Greek mythology is just how chaotic it gets, so I think that's carried across to Then Things Went Dark, with just how chaotic things get when, and then similarly in the way that Persephone and Hades are performing, when 6 different people are performing for the cameras and you're never quite sure what's real and what's something they really feel, right down to like the relationships they're forming and what they're just doing for screen time.
I'm super excited to read that one. I mean, I'll wait, but you know, I'm already excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. That's coming out summer next year, so it's hopefully more detail.
Yeah. So thank you so much again for joining me and talking about Girl Goddess Queen. It was like really, really like a pleasure for me, and I can't wait to see what you put out next.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.